Good morning, everyone. Just wanted to welcome everyone to our webinar on the international transportation and logistics. My name is Hayden Romig, and I'm the engagement executive for the Southern California territory at WUSADA. Before I'd like to begin, just go over a few housekeeping items. This webinar is recorded, and the recording will be made available to all attendees after the session. To minimize background noise, all participants will be muted during the presentation. However, we encourage you to ask questions during the Q&A feature at any time during the webinar. We will have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where our speaker will address as many questions as possible. If we don't get to your question during the live session, we will follow up with you via email. Now I'm thrilled to announce our speaker for today's webinar, Tom McKelvey from DSG Global Academy. Tom is a licensed customs broker and international trade compliance professional with 30+ years of success advising U.S. and foreign multinational companies on import-export operations. He has extensive experience working with U.S. Customs, disclosures, government investigations, audits, and proven ability to effectively minimize or eliminate company penalties and fines by utilizing strategic planning and effective controls. Oh, thank you. In previous roles, Tom was a trade compliance officer for Umicore USA, a founding member of the Trade and Customs Advisory Service Group at FedEx. Prior to joining FedEx, Tom was a manager for KPMG's Trade and Custom Practice. He was involved in a variety of international trade functions, such as global supply chain cost reduction, duty drawback, foreign trade zones, duty recovery reduction methods, and compliance risk management. Tom has also worked in trade compliance leadership roles for the Fortune 500 companies such as GE Aviation, Sony, HCL America, and Point Trade Services, a leading FTZ consulting firm. Tom also has experience as a trade and customs service provider. He was a partner in customs brokerage firm and has responsibility for the management of brokerage operations. He worked with various ABI software applications and implemented the most efficient and effective system in the brokerage operations. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Tom to begin the presentation. Tom, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Can everybody see my screen good? Good. So the life cycle of an export, you identify your customer, you have export documentation, you have transportation, and then you have customs and duties and landed cost. So today we're going to talk about the modes of transportation, which modes suit your food group or product groups, Incoterms, insurance, common transportation errors, and then recommendation and best practices. So the common modes of transportation is ocean freight, air freight, trucking, rail freight, intermodal transportation, refrigerated containers, tanker trucks, bulk cargo ships, reefer ships, and then courier services. Which mode should you use? You have to look at your product characteristics, distance and location, cost and budget, speed and urgency, regulations and compliance, logistics and infrastructure, the environmental impact, customer requirements, risk management, trade agreements, and incentives. So with ocean freight, the advantages is it's cost effective for bulk food exports. You have wide global coverage, ideal for non-perishable food products. The disadvantages, though, is the long transit times, risk of damage or spoilage, and then temperature control challenges. Air freight, you have the advantage of faster transit times, ideal for perishable goods, reliable and secure. The disadvantages is it's expensive. Freight cost is definitely way more expensive than it is for ocean. You have limited capacity, you have fuel surcharges and security fees. Refrigerated containers. The advantages is maintain consistent temperature, ideal for perishable food products, reduces spoilage and damage. The disadvantage is higher costs, limited availability, energy consumption, and environmental impact. And one of the things that we find is in my experience, is who's responsible for maintaining the refueling of the container, and ensuring that the right controls are in place. I had a client one time that was importing horseradishes from Hungary, and the reefer was not being refueled. It was very hot outside, and it was sitting in a rail yard. The rail yard was responsible for refueling the container. It was not happening. So FDA would not allow the product to enter into the commerce of the United States. So those type of situations can be very costly to a company. And the thing is understanding and looking at the challenges that pose to you in that. So we just want to make sure, every area of risk is identified, and how do you minimize that risk? Truck, the advantages is flexible door-to-door delivery, ideal for shorter distances or smaller food shipments, cost effective for regional exports. The disadvantage is limited global coverage, traffic and border crossing delays, security risks. And again, if you're familiar or not familiar with the crossings, when you move a container or a truckload across the border, the challenges, especially going into Mexico, is what happens is the product moves to a how should I put it? The trailer is dropped in a yard on the United States side. All the paperwork is done up, and the Mexican broker has sent all the paperwork. At that point, once the broker has filed the entry into Mexico, you get what is called a red light or a green light. Then a drayage company comes in, picks up the container, moves it across the border. And then if it goes for further exam, it gets, under customs review at the border. If you have a green light and it's already cleared, it just moves on to the yard on the Mexican side. The container's dropped, and then the Mexican trucker goes in and picks it up. These type of situations, it really have to be factored in to that transit time and the challenges with that. And a lot of times on the border, the yard that the trailer's dropped in may close at 5 p.m. And with border congestion and everything else, it can be very difficult for the drayage company to get there before they've closed. It just a lot of steps are necessary in the process to make sure things are very well organized to ensure that everything moves across smoothly. Rail freight, again, the advantages is cost effective for long distance hauls, environmentally friendly, it's secure, reliable. Limited global coverage is the disadvantage, transshipment requirements, and infrastructure limitations. Intermodal advantages, so you may move a container via the rail from the United States up to Canada, and then it's placed on a ship and then shipped across. Again, there's different hands that are touching it, and it's just ensuring that all the handoffs are handled properly, it's effective, documentation's in order, and wanting to ensure that you limit the risks in those handoffs. Courier, again, it's fast, reliable door-to-door delivery. It's ideal for small or high-value shipments. You have the ability to track and monitor it as it's progressing across. The disadvantages is obviously it's very expensive. It's not meant for your large type of shipments. Limited capacity, and then security risks. The mode by product type, again, you have perishable foods, meats, dairies, fruit, vegetables, air freight or refrigerated containers for long distance exports, truck or rail freight for shorter distances. And you really have to factor in all these type of situations. What are you shipping? What is your customer's requirements? What are the challenges within that country? Does the documentation require legalization of the documents by a chamber of commerce or by an embassy? So what are those requirements within those specific countries you're shipping to? And what are the challenges for the modes of transportation within those countries? For non-perishable foods, canned goods, dry ingredients, ocean freight for bulk exports, again, trucking or rail freight for shorter distances, high value or specialty foods, gourmet cheeses, chocolates, even wines, things like that. You really want to look at that. And courier services or air freight are the fastest and most secure. Bulk food commodities, grains, sugars, coffees. Again, ocean freight is the most cost-effective transportation. When you run into temperature-sensitive food, like frozen foods or pharmaceutical goods, again, it's just making sure that who is responsible for refueling that reefer container as it moves along the way. Is that language really spelled out in your agreements? Do you have a freight forwarder, or do you have direct contracts with the steamship lines directly? These are all things that have to be looked at. Food products requiring rapid delivery, again, fresh produce, meats, air freight or truck is really your best shipping option. Then food products with special handling requirements, like fish, especially fresh fish. You're going to use, again, a lot of times in that regard, you're going to use a courier service or you're going to use a direct type of trucking. You really have to look at what the requirements are. Insurance, you have marine and cargo insurance. You have cargo insurance, air cargo insurance, land transportation insurance, empty container insurance. You really want to make sure your product's insured for risk of loss. You want to look at the different costs around this insurance. Some companies have a global policy in place for their movements. Other companies may not. They may use their freight forwarder and insure it through their freight forwarder. When it comes to Incoterms, there are standardized terms that define the roles and responsibility of the buyer in selling international transactions. Incoterms specify who's responsible for paying and managing the shipment, insurance, documentation, customs clearance, and logistics activities. And one of the things there that I want to talk about is when you're shipping DDP, and that's delivered duties paid, you're defining that the seller is responsible for paying for the duties, the taxes, all that product to the delivery of the customer. There's where it gets some challenges because you may not be registered in that country. So you're going to be stuck paying the GST tax, or you may not, in the sense that who's going to be the importer of record into that country. So DDP defines who is paying for that, who's responsible for paying for it, but it doesn't define who is going to be the broker. Are you using your broker? Are you using the customer's broker? And is it going to be cleared under your name going into that country, or is it going to be cleared under your customer's name? So if it clears under your customer's name, they're going to pay the GST tax or VAT tax. They're going to pay the duties and all that. That's going to be on them, not to pay it, but they're going to be the importer record. So you really want to define, when you're dealing with your customer and you're shipping on a DAP or a DDP purpose, who is responsible for the customs clearance? You're responsible for paying the duties and taxes. You're responsible for the customs clearance fees, but it doesn't mean it's clearing. You're responsible for the importer of record. Whose name is it going to be cleared under? And these are things that really have to be defined when you're in that process. So it's important to really look at the Incoterms and when you're shipping. And I really recommend you don't do DDP. And again, when you do DAP, deliver at place, you need to define the actual place that's going to, where you're delivering it to. It may be to the airport. It may be to the rail yard. It may be to the ocean port. That is the place of delivery, or it may be to your customer's door. But those things really need to be defined, because what can happen is let's say the customer's taking forever to get it cleared. There's going to be storage charges that are going to accrue, or demurrage charges. And those things need to be looked at, and who's responsible for those costs. And you really need to really define those things when you're exporting your product. And I don't know, do we want to stop here for a second? Does anybody have questions? Okay. But Incoterms are very important in defining, who's responsible. But you really need to make sure you define also who's going to be the importer of record, who is going to, whose VAT number is going to be used. And if you're not a registered importer into that country, how do you get that VAT back? So you really need to look at those things. Common transportation errors: inadequate packing, including solid wood packing material. Do you have the certificate for solid wood packing material? The labeling's wrong. Insufficient refrigeration, like I said, where you have a reefer running out of fuel. Delays in transit. Failure to comply with your regulations. Maybe your documentation is less than adequate. So you want to make sure, what are the specific requirements within that country, so that you have the documentation done correctly the first time prior to ever leaving. Does it require, some type of consulate or embassy stamps prior to it ever being leaving the country? You want to make sure all those things are in place. Inadequate insurance coverage. I would say the biggest issue is poor communication. And a lot of times it's you don't know what you don't know, and that's where it gets costly. Failure to consider seasonal factors, inadequate tracking and monitoring, failure to follow security protocols, and then inadequate training. These are the top 12 things that we find are reasons why shipments have issues. So our recommendation is choose the right mode of transportation. Obviously, you want to understand what is the contract between you and your customer. What are the requirements under that contract? Making sure you're following the contract and what the requirements are spelled out in there. And if they're not spelled out, then I would make sure you have some type of documentation between you and the buyer, explaining who is responsible for each of the steps along the way. And the other issue that it has to be thought about too is, like I said, on DDP shipments, you also can create a tax liability for yourself in another country by being the importer of record. So it's called permanent establishment, and that can subject your company to tax liability within that country. And you really want to make sure how that is spelled out and to minimize that type of exposure. Optimizing routes and schedules. You want to make sure that, even with the airlines, if it misses a flight or it's delayed, But if it misses a flight or a connection, what is the options? How many other flights are behind that allow you to move, or is it just a weekly flight? Those are things that need to be looked at. Use of refrigerated transportation. You want to make sure you're using a reputable company that has the infrastructure in place to make sure that is consistently being monitored, it's working properly, and it's being refueled. Implement a track and trace system. A lot of times your freight forwarder offers that service. The steamship lines offer it. So you want to look at that, and that gives you better visibility. Utilization of consolidated services. There's pros and cons to that. It gives you better costing because you're bulking your goods with other customers. So you're getting a better rate, but at the same time, you want to make sure that your freight's not being held up. So if you're using a consolidated container, and it's your products and other customers' products in that container, is there something in that container that could hold up it with customs in a foreign country because there's something that is unmanifested in that product? And then that ties up the whole container and it causes you delay. So those are things you want to really look at. Consider door-to-door service. There's definitely advantages with the door-to-door service, but again, it's much more expensive. Ensure that you have the proper packaging and labeling. With food products, you have requirements within each country, in understanding what those requirements are and making sure you have the right approvals in place prior to ever exporting. Leverage technology. Again, having that track and trace system in place, having your documents where they're sent electronically. Your customer can pull down the documents from a share file or something like that is always important. Develop relationships with your logistics provider. I recommend that you have a statement of work in place with that logistics provider so that expectations are being met. Plan for contingencies. Again, like I said, if a flight, if it misses a connection, your product misses a connection on a flight, what is the next flight out that it could go on? What happens if your product's tied up because of a customs exam for unmanifested goods? What are your contingency plans in those situations? Make sure you're complying with both U.S. and the country's shipping to regulations. It's important. You on the U.S. side is the who's doing your automated export system filings, your EEI. If it's a routed shipment where you're delivering it to the U.S. border and then they're taking it across, who's filing the EEI record if it's over $2,500? And then use of sustainable transportation options is important. These are things that we always recommend to look at in when you're moving your freight. Does anyone have any questions? Hayden?
Yes, sir.
I'm not seeing anybody having any questions. I know everybody's on mute, so I'm not sure if I'm missing any questions being asked.
Nope. I got Mark to put a question in the chat. It is my understanding Incoterms are not legally binding. Is that correct?
Incoterms, I don't agree with that. They are legally binding, but what you have to look at too is Incoterms defines the risk of loss. What it doesn't define is when does title of transfer happen. those are things that you want to spell out. When does that title transfer happen and who's responsible at that time? So Incoterms are legally binding, but that's for the risk of loss. And you really want to make sure you're following if you have a contract with that buyer or supplier, you just want to make sure you're following the what is in that contract. And if there's differences, then you need to work out those differences and do an update to the contract or an addendum to that contract. But there's going to be things that, like I said, with DDP, that who is responsible? You're paying the customs duties and taxes. You're responsible. The seller's responsible for paying it, but it doesn't define who's actually the importer of record into that country. And you really want to define that. And those are things that are important to define as part of this process.
Thank you, Mark. Does anybody else have any questions? Don't be afraid to unmute yourself or raise your hand. Let's see here. Miguel, can you explain the title of ownership of the goods through a CIF operation?
So title, again, title shifts when you define it in the contract. Incoterms doesn't define the title at what point the title changes. So a lot of times it's defined in the contract that it title of ownership transfers while it's in the air. The reason that's done is, again, from a tax liability. Most companies don't want to be responsible for taxes within that country. So you want to make sure the transfer of title for the product happens outside of that country. But again, the risk of loss is done through the through your Incoterms, but your contract's going to define when the title is transferred. Who owns that product at what point? And you want to define that well in your contracts or some type of agreement, your sales order, or your it could be done through a purchase order also, but I'd recommend you do it through a contract or a sales order agreement. And if it's done through a purchase order, again, that it's spelled out clearly on that purchase order that you're receiving from your buyer.
Perfect. Anybody else have any lingering questions that you'd like Tom to answer? All righty, Tom. I'm not seeing anything more. I think we'll just go ahead and conclude our webinar today. If there's any additional questions that may linger or that you think of throughout the day, don't be afraid to shoot one of us an email. We'll make sure we get you in contact with Tom with those questions. But with that, I think we are all set here. All righty.
Well, thank you, everybody.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.